Hello, my name is Darrell Pruitt. I'm with the Sugar Hill Historic Preservation Society. Without question, one of the most impactful, life-changing events in the history of Sugar Hill was the creation of Lake Lanier in the 1950s. Today, we are honored to have with us Robert David Coughlin, the author of the definitive book on that event, Lake Sidney Lanier, a Storybook Site. Dave, thank you for being with us today.
You're welcome.
Let's start by just telling us a few things about yourself, your background, where you're from.
I was originally from North Carolina. My father was in the military there. Both my mother and father are from Georgia, and they moved there when he was in the military. And so when he retired, they moved back to Georgia. Okay. I was still living in North Carolina at the time, and I just happened to come up for a visit and applied. I had a teacher certification, applied for a job in Gwinnett County, several counties around, and I got hired in Forsyth County.
Okay.
And at the end of the year, one of my colleagues asked me if had I decided on what I was going to do over the summer, and basically I was nothing. And he said, well, he worked out at Lake Lanier. He was a park ranger, seasonal park ranger. He said, if you want me to get an interview. So I got the interview and I ended up getting the job. And probably a couple of months into it, or a month into it, it was a summer position from May until the end of September, and then you were off in the season. In the off season of winter, you didn't work. Mm-hmm. And I was riding with another ranger there who was also a school teacher, and he would ask me if I had had the opportunity to look at some of the photos they made when they were building the dam. They had kept them had them in a box, and I said no. And one day a week, I think it was one day a week. Then back then, you had to pull dispatch desk duty for the other rangers that were in the field. So you answered the phone, you did the radio, and whatnot. So I pulled out the photographs, started looking at them. I spent most of the summer just looking at them. Now some of them I could tell exactly what they were because I had spent enough time traveling around the lake and the reservoir and working the parks, and I knew where I was. Mm-hmm. Some of them I didn't. Luckily, at the time, there were 3, maybe 4 park rangers that were working at that time that actually worked as construction and contract workers when they built the dam.
Eyewitness.
And they were there. The resource manager was an engineer, and several of the park rangers, I think the chief ranger at the time, had done work like mosquito control, cruising for timber. He'd done a lot of things when they were building the lake. Gotcha. So after building the dam and after the lake formed and they needed park rangers, well, they were perfect for the position, so they hired him. So if I ran into a problem where I wasn't sure what I was looking at, I'd just get one of them saying, what is this? And then they'd explain what it was. I can't put a finger on a particular moment where I had an aha moment, like I'm going to write a book about this.
That's what I was going to ask you.
Okay. I can't tell you. I do know that at the time I was teaching in Forsyth County, one of the science teachers there was a genealogist, and he had published several genealogical books, and he may have mentioned it. He may have put it together. I do know I was putting a slide presentation together for my students to use during the year, and one of the things that I kept running into was when I was trying to get background information, there was no single body of work on this. It was you could find bits and pieces of things, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but nothing where you could sit down and say, okay, you have got a book and you write it. So I thought, anyway, somewhere around the late 80s, I decided, well, I'm gonna try my hand at this. I was stumbling around in the dark. I didn't have a clue what I was doing, and never even entertained the idea that if I ever got it done, how I was gonna get it published. Those things they were way off in the future, and they needed to stay there. If I had thought about those things, I may have just said, no, I don't think I'm going to do this.
That's the best way, a little bit at a time.
Yeah. You stumble in, move around and get comfortable with what you're doing. In 1998, I had enough, and I realized that when you start looking for publishers for things like this, because it has such a regional flavor about it, it's not something that's I've sold books all over the world, but they were people that were familiar with the area that might be living in Seattle, Washington, or California, who had property up here, had relatives, and they said, we would like the book. Canada. I sold 2 or 3 in Canada. I don't know what the connection was there, but I may have talked to some people. I worked with a woman who was a contractor and was doing something for Lake Lanier Islands, and she was from Canada. Her company was from Canada. Anything. But I realized that if this was going to get published, I was going to have to self-publish. And so I talked to several people. I think that's what the gentleman I was talking about in Forsyth County had said, look, I self-publish, and I have a publisher and a guy that prints it. He's not a publisher, he's a printer. So he basically just prints. He designs the book, and then he'll give you copies. Then after that, it's up to you. Yeah. So I worked with him a little bit, and then there used to be a bookstore in Cumming that truly was a bookstore. It wasn't a big time company. He owned a bookstore, and he was in business for a number of years there. But one of the people that he had do some work for him, her name was Nancy Pashili, and he got me in contact with her, and she actually designed the book. So Nancy, I basically just gave her all the text. I gave her all the photographs and said, "Here, she designed this."
It's an amazing book, and there's so much information in there. It really boggles the mind.
And she did, and I think this was the first book she'd ever done, and he got her in contact with me, and we sat down. She said, "Yeah, I'd like to try to do this," and so we worked. It takes. She was living in the area at the time. She's since moved out of Georgia, but I'd have to go to her place sometimes, and then she'd send me when she got information together. And this is a long, drawn-out process. It took about 6 months. And it was basically because I'm working on one for Hartwell, too. Yeah. And when I started doing the Hartwell book, I told her, if she wanted to do the design, I'm going to try to make it a little easier for her. But as I said before, I just gave her the text. I gave her all the photographs I had, and I said, in the text, it will say figure 1-1 or chapter 2-1, but I didn't say, crop here. You look at a photograph and you may not be interested. I may know that I want the bottom left hand of that picture. Well, she cropped the top right. I never thought about things like that. So she sent me things, and I said, no, I want it moved over. So when I did the Hartwell one, been working on it, I decided early on that what I'm going to do is I'm going to give her a Word document, and it'll show her exactly what I want. It won't be the one that I'll use. She'll have to redesign it, but it'll show her where all the photographs are, where the text is. And well,
you're a veteran now. You know what you're doing.
Well, for making it easier for her, it turned out, basically after I sent her the first document, she said, what do you need me for? This thing is print ready. You can take this and print it. So I've been doing that. But back then, this was all before everything was pre-digital.
Oh yeah.
I took photographs on the back of trucks, the tailgate of truck, to get the lighting right, and I bought a camera where I could focus in on a photograph. I mean, you don't do any of that stuff now. You just go on a computer and click, and it's done. Okay. So it's a lot easier, and you don't have to carry. I carry everything around in the whole book was carried around now on my computer, and back then, I had satchels of photographs, and you would type things over and over again. It didn't even use a computer. Mm-hmm. And
I remember those days. Yeah.
So I published it in '98, and then I've redid it in 2015, and it just basically covers the lake's early history. It pretty much ends at the groundbreaking, and when the lake filled up, and after that, things have changed. But I didn't, that would be another story to be told.
I know one of the things, and I want to get to this in a minute, but before I forget, I did want to ask you a couple of questions about. I think I read or heard you say that you were either principal or assistant principal at Lanier Middle School for a while.
I was an administrator at Lanier Middle School.
Okay.
For 8 years.
About what time period was that?
I became an administrator there, and I was in Forsyth County till '89. I came here in '89, and then I left Lanier in '97 and took a job as a community school director at South Gwinnett High School, and that's where I was when I retired. I stayed there until I retired in '09.
Okay. And now I'm really curious about this park ranger thing. is that something that always interested you? I mean, what is just out of nowhere you needed something to do for the summer, or was it?
Well, he just basically came. He was a history teacher in the school with me, taught with me, and he had a job as a seasonal park ranger. And he asked me, I interviewed for the job, and when after I left the interview and I drove back, did it on my planning period, and then drove back to school. I thought, well, I got to drive out and see the lake. That's about all it's going to. I mean, there was no reason asking me questions about being a park ranger. I'd never been a park ranger before, and so I just I didn't even think about it. 3-4 weeks went on, and I'm at the house working one weekend, and my wife said, "Hey, I was doing something in the outside." She said, "Look, some guy just called you. He's with the Corps of Engineers." Mm-hmm. Or he said, "There's a gentleman here. He's calling you." And I said, "I don't recognize the name." He said, "He was with the Corps." And I thought, well, I'll talk to him. And I answered the phone. He said, "Hey, would you like the job?" And I thought, "Oh, sure." And when I hung up, I said, I'll try it. So I showed up that next Monday. I said, "No." I said, "When do you want me to start?" This was like a Saturday. He said, "Monday." And I went, "Well,
oh, wow.
I do teach, and I don't get out till 3:30, 4 o'clock, so I can't." He said, "That's all right, because we have probably 7 or 8 seasonal rangers or temporary rangers that they're all teachers." And I think they hired them because they knew they were probably stable enough that they would be there the next year and the next year. And I was there for a number of years after that. So they kept the same people. They didn't have to retrain them. Okay. They knew they'd always be there. They were more likely to leave or quit. They'd come back. Mm-hmm. And so I did it the first summer. I spent the first summer, learning how to do the job. And the same guy that hired me told me, he said, "Listen, when the first day I went to work there, he said, your biggest asset to me is, I understand that you don't know much about the area or being a park ranger, but is your visitation. People seeing you in the truck, seeing you in the uniform and driving around, that's what we need you the most for, is the fact that people, you would be given a certain area of the lake to work at night or during the day, and then at night you would par up with somebody else, so you never rode in the truck alone. But the work areas always overlapped, so you had one ranger leaving and coming. So it was just a maze of people driving around to campers and the day use areas see a park ranger in the park. So, and after the first year, I enjoyed it. I got to see something.
You must enjoy it. You're still kind of doing it.
And now I just work the desk. That's a young man's game, running up and down those hills and having to deal with the people. I just don't. You get older, you don't have so much patience. And he basically came to me and asked me when I retired. He said, you understand what these guys in the field are doing, so we would rather have somebody on the desk that knows what they're actually involved in, that knows the parks too, so that if they call in and say, "I'm at such and such a park, I'm at the restrooms," you mentally have an idea of where that is, so that when you call Hall County or Gwinnett County or Forsyth County police and say, "Look, we got an officer who's in this park, he needs assistance, blah, blah, blah," and you can give them information that somebody who maybe has never worked here before or never worked as a park ranger understands. So after I retired, I started out just working weekends, and then this past year, the woman that worked the desk there, dispatch, had been there for years. She decided she wanted to retire, and he asked me if I'd do it, and I said, "Look, I'll try it. I mean, it's as I said before, it's just I work 5 days a week now, and I don't work the weekends, which is nice because I work weekends for I don't seemingly ever. I never had 4th of July off for
part time.
Yeah. So I don't. It's not hard work. It's just you have to be there. You have to wait for a phone call or wait for a radio call from the Rangers, and so that's basically how I got involved in working as a park ranger.
That's very interesting. Let me ask you this: was being a park ranger what got you interested in the dam and the lake, or were you always kind of interested in that historical kind of stuff, or was just being around it made you more and more interested?
Well, seeing the photographs, and then talking to people, and when in that first season, driving around, seeing everything. I've got an advantage doing the work for the Lanier that I've done that I don't have at Hartwell, because I've never worked as a park ranger at Hartwell. I've driven around all over that lake, but I've never actually worked it like I did Lanier. Also, too, by the time I started doing Hartwell's, I didn't have the same resources and personnel there because they had retired and left because Hartwell was built right after Lanier.
Yeah.
So immediately, and matter of fact, they overlapped. The resident engineer left Lanier and went to Hartwell. He was Allatoona, Lanier, Hartwell, and then he retired eventually down the road. But so they were built one right after another. But I didn't get started on Hartwell until it was almost 30 years. It had been in operation 30 years versus 20-something years for Lanier, and those people at Lanier are still working there, whereas the ones at Hartwell had retired by the time I got there. So I didn't have that resource, which it just, the photographs, looking at them, looking over things, talking to people, and then once I started just doing the research. And you find things everywhere. You find that people, I would go here, there, wherever I could go. I spent a lot of time at UGA in their library, and they have a documents room where all the hearings were held. And
let me stop you real quick. For all you young people that are watching this, or future generations, what Dave is talking about is the day before the internet existed.
Oh yeah.
And then you couldn't just Google stuff. You had to go to a library or this or that to get information.
And you would, it's correct. It was all pre-internet and digital nothing. The cameras were all, you had film in them. And if you went to take a photograph of something, you might have to take 20, 30 pictures and then hope you get the right one, where now you just take a photo, you don't like that, I'll just go to the next one.
Right.
I mean, just so much more expensive too. There's a lot of expense involved in it. But I spent a lot of times, weekends at libraries. There were some people that lived in this area whose parents they found a box of stuff when they were cleaning out their parents' attic or their basement, and then they found some film with them building the dam that this guy had made over in Buford, had made over the whole 7 or 8 year period it took to build.
Is that was in your presentation?
Some of them were, yeah. And then there was some film at the Hartsville papers and the James C. Davis papers, a congressman down at Emory University and Woodruff Library there.
Oh, okay.
UGA Library. I don't know how many weekends I spent 3 or 4 hours there.
Wow.
And you got bits and pieces of history here and there. You'd see things, you'd make copies of them, and then it might look interesting. You would think, I don't have a clue where it's going to go, but I'll just save it. And then eventually I got down to simply putting down on paper and writing how and dividing things up how you wanted it to go. And I learned early on, I was talking to somebody about doing this process. You see certain things the way books are written, and you think, well, I like that format, and I use it. There is no right or wrong way to write a book. It's whatever interests you. I try to follow guidelines set in publication and acknowledgments and stuff, but for the most part, you just write it the way you want to write it because it's your book.
Right. Well, obviously, it was a labor of love because you don't put that much time into something that you're not really, really passionate about doing. And you have created a resource that is a treasure. So I don't know if you wondered sometimes if all those hours were worth it, but you have given the community and posterity something that we wouldn't have had that's very valuable.
Well, it's the process of doing it. I'm not a real big fan of getting up and talking about it. I've never been comfortable around people doing that, and I would rather. It's getting the information, the knowledge sometimes where I could put it at some point in time, once you got something written down, you got a diagram or a template of how you want it, then it's just a matter of you find something else new, where am I going to put it? I'll insert it right here.
Yeah.
That has been a whole lot easier with the internet. I mean, the Word documents and things that you can get, It's so much easier to place things where if you had it typewritten, you just have to draw an arrow and then you go back and type everything again, whereas now you just insert it right in, put a photograph in, and but that's how it went. It's just I found things right up until a month. I can remember giving Nancy, sending her something, look, you need to insert this in this chapter. I found this, and so I want to add this into it. Mm-hmm. I know she was probably thinking, this thing ever going to end?
We got to stop somewhere.
Yeah. And I can remember a professor I had when I was in college. We were talking one day. This is years before I moved to Georgia. Hadn't even thought about writing, but I remember talking about writing or doing a dissertation or doing any kind of project like that. She said, at some point in time, you got to write. You got to quit theorizing and quit, making notes and drafts. You got to put a body of work together. And I guess it just reached a point where I thought, well, I could continue writing this thing. 30 years later, I could be writing it. And I just going to need to publish. And when I published the book in '98, and in 2015, I had found some other photographs that I wanted to insert. So I added some things to it that weren't in the initial publication.
Gotcha.
So that's the process, pretty much how it went.
I'm going to take you back now a little bit. And one of the most interesting things that I learned from the book, and then also once I heard you do your presentation, is that where the dam is now was not the original site that they had planned to put the dam. It was...
Well, that's like when doing some research at the UGA at the library, there are several places, but particularly there, I found some old a ACF River development map that was done by the Corps of Engineers in the 30s. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the research is like that, where you see something, you see just a snippet of something, maybe a 3 or 4 sentence, a small paragraph or something that was mentioned. You're not sure what you're going to do with it, whether it's even interested in anybody else, but you make a copy of it and you file it away, in a way here and there. And in this development map was they put what they call selected sites and proposed sites, and the proposed sites were ones that they thought they might want to do something with. The select sites were one that we're going to honestly try to do something with these sites. And you start with a big list, and you whittle it down, and where it's a smaller list, and the names change on it. But they had a south of Atlanta, they had in a little box. They had them, and they have little dotted lines and dashes depending on what it was selected or proposed. They had what was called the Roswell. Site.
Oh.
And then this was the 1930 something. There was no mention of Buford on that map. Now later on, there was the map they did in the 40s or the 50s. There was Buford, but there was Roswell too. They kept it there. They went back and forth on those. Roswell might have had some advantages over Buford, and then Buford had some advantages, and there was a war, it's in the book, there's a War Department memo that says the Buford site is chosen over the Roswell site for these reasons. It was further north, it's further up the Chattahoochee River, in an area where you got more rainfall on average. Less infrastructure relocation costs, because half the project's budget, almost half, was buying land, paying people out. Had it been in Roswell, there were more people living in that area. And the site was a little better, topographically, it was better for building a dam than maybe Roswell site was. At the time that they were proposing and doing drill studies, they were drilling, all over North Georgia, trying to figure a site where they're going to build a dam. I think he was the South Atlantic Division chief at the time. He came out and said, "This is a storybook site for a dam." He said, "If you mark all the things that you'd like to see present, it's got them." And so that's why they chose, and as I said, they chose Buford and started working on Buford. And the Roswell, it stayed on the map for years, and then eventually they dropped it. Whether there was ever serious consideration for building a dam that close to Buford ever again, probably not. About where the location is, where Highway 400 crosses over, the Chattahoochee River crosses over under 400. That's where the dam was going to be. Because you had escarpment on it. It was an area where the topography narrowed, and the river, it was a narrow river valley versus being a wider one.
That is fascinating to me, to think it could have been Roswell Dam.
And you've got a pre-impoundment map in the library of the museum over there that was on Buford. Well, I talked to a guy after the book was first published, who lived in Roswell, and he had one of those pre-impoundment maps for Roswell. That's how far in advance they'd gone into building one. They went in and did aerial surveys, and they knew exactly where the dam was going to be and what acreage was going to be when the lake fully formed. And at the time the book was published, and what is it? Hindsight is 20/20. I mean, I should have met with him and said, "I'd like to take a look at this," but I do know, I remember him talking to me about it. He said, "I found it in there. in one of their historical societies down there, and I didn't even know what it was. And it's what they used as fishing guides here for years. And then back, they did a story, a story was done probably about, I want to say 8-9 years ago, up in Washington, D.C., in the chief of engineer's office there. They found a bunch of documents and things that had been stored in a warehouse or a room there. Wow. And one of them was a big roll of architectural designs and the aerial surveys, topographic maps for Buford. And it's the one they made, those green, the ones you've got in the museum, they made that from these, and they sent them to Buford, and they sent them back to the division or district years ago, but they were in a big, huge, I mean, these things were probably, 3 or 4 feet tall. They were bigger because they were drawn on, they were designs and of what the lake, where the shoreline was going to be, elevation and everything.
That's so cool.
They had already done one on Roswell, so that's how close they came to building it at Roswell. And it could have gone either way, or if they'd have built it sooner, they might have chosen Roswell over Buford.
Well, I'm certainly happy that they built it where they did. And let me ask you another question. That there were families, people that had to be relocated under the flood waters when the pool would rise. The lake was full. About how many families, people do you know, were actually relocated?
About 700 families had to be relocated.
700 families. That's, when you think about the area of that lake, and that's only 700 families, from what it looks like now, it was really a rural area, wasn't it?
Very rural. And that was another reason they chose the Buford site over, is that when he said that, it's a storybook site, you don't have the complication of having cities close by that have to be inundated. Now, Cumming, Gainesville, Sugar Hill, they're close by, but they really, you got some land in Sugar Hill that might have been in the Sugar Hill proper or unincorporated, but for the most part, there's no towns, and there were farming communities, a lot of those, but not. A community today takes on a different, if you say farming community versus community. Right.
Tell us what a farming community would
it would have been a group of people living in a certain area in a county that you might have a mom and pop store that serviced a small number of people in a section. That's what I mean by farming communities. There was a lot of absentee landlords living, meaning they own property. If you go to LakeLanierHistory.com, it's set up now for showing the tracks. You can cross-reference the property by the owner's name, the county it was in, or the track number, and you'll see a lot of these photographs they took of what they call improvements, which were anything that was on the property other than the land. And you could see that people weren't living in some of these homes, and they own the land, they own the property, and they just weren't living there. But that 700 families is a lot. I mean, if it was your family, but it's a lot of people have to relocate. But considering some of the other projects that the Corps may have been involved in, or the Department of Interior, if you're relocating people, it's by virtue small. Because Buford Dam is, I think it's 38,000 acres, if I'm not mistaken, right? But I mean, it's the largest lake solely within the borders of Georgia. Hartwell's bigger, but it's shared by South Carolina, so it's solely within the borders of Georgia as long as it's the largest man-made lake.
A lot of area. And I remember you saying this when I heard you talk the other day too. There was not originally a plan. We all know Buford Dam Road if we live in this area. Buford Dam Road is a major thoroughfare now, really, in a lot of ways. But if I understood you correctly, there was no plan originally to make that a road. They were just going to build a dam and a road maybe to the dam. Or
the research that I've been able to uncover by looking at the photographs, talking to people who lived in the area, talking to these gentlemen that were park rangers there, Buford Dam Road initially was more construction road. It was built more to get people who lived in the gentleman I was talking about, resource manager, Cecil Patterson at the time, when he was an engineer, he lived in Forsyth County at one point. I think it was a resource manager, but a lot of them lived in Hall County, so they had to get there.
Gotcha.
And you had to get equipment in and out of there. It was very rural.
Yeah.
You didn't you built batching and mixing plants for the concrete. I mean, you had to get people in and out, had to get equipment in and out, and they were mostly construction road, access roads.
How about that?
And it just turned out after once the lake was finished and that they used Buford Dam Road, paved it, and used it. And for years, it wasn't used much, but to get people in and out of the parks. And they realized too, we've got parks here now.
Okay.
We got to have a way to get these people to the parks that are on the south end of the lake.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there are even plans, at some point in time to make a roadway and to basically divert traffic away from the dam and make it further downstream, like they did at Hoover, where you get you get to a certain point and just go around all that, so you don't have as much traffic on the dam and use the roadways that are there now. But I mean, whether that'll ever be funded or not, at some point in time it might.
So much development and everything now, right up next to the river.
But no, it was never intended to be a thoroughfare like it is now, like it was compared to now.
Let me ask you another question. That the parks, the Corps of Engineer parks. I mean, I enjoy the heck out of them. I know many people do. Was that originally in the plans, or did
they knew there were going to be recreational areas. Around the lake. They knew at some point, as one of the organizations, it was administratively dissolved in the 90s, I think. It's called the UCDA, Upper Chattahoochee Development Association. It started in the late 40s. And it was designed, basically what it was is you had men or women from all would come to meetings that belonged to this organization, and they were from people that were from the county surrounding the lake that would make up the lake on ways that they could better develop the area. And it dissolved because they probably figured there are already governmental agencies that were now doing that kind of work, and that wasn't necessary to be in existence. But their job was to look at, how can we best use the resources. They knew they were going to. I've seen designs that they were going to make for a lot of the parks all over the lake, and they knew there were going to be recreational areas. So they made use of some of the roads that would and roadways and trails that might end up being inundated, and where they go right into the water's edge. You might put a boat ramp there, put a park close by, so you've got access to it. So they used those types of things, and that was their mindset when they were putting all this together. Because a lot of this was kind of new, even though they've been building dams since the 30s or 40s. It was still relatively this area. They'd never seen anything like this before. So
I don't want to get off on too much of a rabbit trail, but this is made me think of like some of the ferries that used to cross the river that are all underwater now, that are north of the dam. I'm assuming maybe some of the parks maybe are somewhere in those areas too, possibly. No,
I don't. I know of some ferries, Lights Ferry or Bridge, and there used to be a ferry there before the bridge was even there. And they did not relocate all the bridges and former ferries that went into the lake by virtue of, they did what was called destination and origin surveys when they were deciding not where the lake was going to be, because they knew where the lake was going to be, when they were deciding which bridges and roads to relocate. If one bridge or a roadway could suffice for or take the place of another one that was maybe a couple of miles down the road, if there was more traffic to it, they would put people on the bridges in these roads in a 24-hour period or 36-hour period in shifts. And when people came by, they'd stop and ask them, where are you coming from? Where are you going? What are you using the road for? Now, back in rural Georgia in the 1950s and 40s, as you sitting on a bridge at 2 o'clock in the morning, chances are somebody that passed by you was probably not up to any good to begin with. And you didn't necessarily want to be stopped by anybody. So I can remember talking to several of the rangers that worked those destination surveys, and they thought, I didn't really care much for being on the road and stopping somebody walking by. But they tried to get as much information together. And sometimes the counties and the surrounding areas disagreed with the findings of the government. And one example is up in Lumpkin County, there was a bridge. I can't remember what the name of the bridge is now, but anyway, the government's findings were different from the county's findings on how well it was used, and they took the government to court, and they were awarded additional funds, and I think they spent the money, their end of it, extending Peachtree Industrial Boulevard at some point down further into Gainesville. So it's but they were trying to figure out how well an area is being used. Can this road take the place of 3 others that's close by, and because if you
build a bridge on all of them.
No, and like I said, that Lights Ferry Bridge, it was right too wide an expanse of water. There was just no way they could build a bridge, half a mile long. It wasn't going to happen. So some of them, I try to think. Keith's Bridge was not replaced. Nick's Bridge. I'm trying to think of Leathers 4. There was early on there was a photograph I ran into in Lumpkin County. It said Leathers, a new bridge. It was written on the back, new bridge. Now I took it to mean it was a new bridge. Now I was looking at the photograph and I thought, if this is a new bridge, I don't know, they must have made it out of some extremely old materials, because it does not. I mean, it was a steel. It looked like it was, cockroaches holding hands. I mean, it was
new when they built it.
Yeah, but that was the name of the bridge. Yeah. New bridge. I didn't know that. I saw new. I thought anyway. But not all the bridges did they replace, and some of them they would in the state. Some of them the state built. Some of them the Corps of Engineers had funds to build, and they didn't build it. The Corps didn't build anything. They just oversaw the private contractors that built things. The specifications were drawn up, and they monitored what they were doing. Yeah. So if the Corps' job was to replace Brown's Bridge, like for instance, they went. That's where we got all the photographs from. And this in the book is they took photographs for congressional appropriation to show progress being made, and so that's where a lot of the photographs existed. Is they were
keep the money coming.
Yeah, you got to show what you why do you need this money? This is what we're doing, but also the progress what they were doing. And a lot of these bridges now, Brown's Bridge, 2 mile, 6 mile. Clark's Bridge. They redid Thompson and Lanier, 20 years ago. Now they're doing they've all, Bells Mills Bridge, all these bridges have been rebuilt, and some of the older ones were torn down as soon as they got the new ones built. Mm-hmm. They had some age to them. And so that was the process. It was, I can remember one of those rangers was talking to me one day, and he said, I can remember working on a boat ramp, and the lake caught us. The lake was rising, and we weren't ready, and we had to build a boat ramp out of the water and then take a bulldozer and push it down in the water. They stopped impoundment several times. And the impoundment process is once they closed the gates, they didn't stop water from flowing, they just slowed it down to the point where the lake could back up. Yeah. And Thompson Bridge, the old one was being about to be inundated, and the new one wasn't ready, so they had to slow the impoundment process and release more water downstream. And then for topping, when it got to 1040, elevation 1040, and then the normal pool of the lake is 1,070 feet when they built it above sea level. Okay. Now it's 1071. They added another foot to it. But when they got to 1040, they basically went all over the lake, and anything sticking out of the water, they cut down. Okay. Or removed. Okay. That's good. So that theoretically, you go from 40 to 70, you got 30 feet where you don't have navigation for the future. You don't. This where it comes in about what they remove. People saying, I've seen whole churches down there. You might have seen remnants of the church, but now there is a building over near where Highway 53 bridge is, Dawson and Hall County, Forsyth County line. There is a house there. It was where the old Keith's Bridge Road used to be. Okay. Whoever built it like to look like a castle, where it had, it's just the outline of it. It was made of stone. Okay. Very unusual photograph, and it's in the book. Yeah. And I was looking at it, I thought, well, that's not a house you see every day in this area. It's still there. The building is still there.
Stone's not going to...
I saw a sonar image of it just probably within the last couple of years. Somebody on Facebook showed me a sonar picture of it, and as soon as I saw it, I said, I know exactly where the house is. I've seen that house before.
Wow.
Now the roof wasn't there, and you could see where the stone outline of the house, the foundation, everything, the house itself is still there. And Lights Bridge, I've seen sonar images of it. Half of it steel, half of it gone, which is unusual because the steel was very valuable, and they would go they would do a lot. They would even take concrete and bust it up to get the steel out of it. So leaving that whole bridge intact was just, I don't understand why they did. Either they got caught, the lake filled up quicker than they could get rid of it, or no one put a bid on or what, but that's very unusual to remain. So foundations, wells, things like that, they were in deep enough water, they weren't going to move them. If it was a house and it was left by, and the owner was absentee owner couldn't find her or they didn't move it. Contractors had clearing jobs where they'd go on the property, say if this room was a tract of land, and they'd say, okay, the contractor had a contract by this date, he'd go on there, and anything that would be a navigation hazard had to be removed.
Yeah.
Now, unfortunately, in some instances, say the owner, when the government purchased the property, they purchased the house, they paid him for the house and everything.
Yeah.
When it was over with, the owner said, I'd like to buy that house back from you because I'd like to move the house. So a lot of times the government would sell the house back to them at maybe a 25% of what they paid for the improvements of it. And they'd say, okay, on the deed it'll spell by December 31st, 1955, you got to have all this gone. So when the contractor, came on to clear it, it might be red tagged, we can't move this because he's got till this date to get it out. Well, January 1st rolled around and that house is still there. Thing is, saying you're going to move a house and moving a house are two entirely different things. And so then the government would have to knock it down. They'd have to go in there and do it themselves because you couldn't leave the house.
No.
It would definitely be it would rot and the wood would float up. So,
Well, I've heard a lot of people say, and I know you got the accurate answer on this, that there were towns.
No towns.
No towns.
Communities.
Just communities.
Communities.
And like you explained
buildings
earlier,
might have a cluster of small buildings that or businesses or something, but if you take those pre-impoundment maps, if you go back and just look at each one of the maps, they'll draw buildings if a building or a school is in an area or a cemetery, but you're not going to see a huge cluster of anything there because there wasn't anything there.
It wasn't.
It was, no large cities.
The graves is obviously a hot topic that people talk about.
It is. By law, they had to move or relocate any grave that would be inundated by water. That being said, they had to know it existed.
Yeah.
You still were in the era where you had a lot of family-owned plots. And if there was a small cemetery on a plot, and it was an absentee landlord, and people that had lived on the land had long since left, and they didn't know who, undergrowth, and they didn't know where if the headstones might have been knocked down. If they didn't know it existed, then it probably could have been covered up.
Sure.
But for the most part, knew. Well, you've seen the cemetery, man. Those people were, the Corps of Engineers was extremely anal when it came to making sure you're going to move it from here, and this is where it's going to go. Now, Hartwell, I didn't find a lot of the cemetery information when I was doing Lanier. Partly because I didn't know it existed, didn't know to look for it. And when I did Hartwell, they printed books. They did books that were published, 3 books. It was groups, 1 through 5, and it was like 2 through 4, and 3 and 5, and then 1. And they would do things like take copper plates, like you see, just flexible plating, and they would stick it at a grave and put a number on it, and then they'd put it at where it was going. And when they moved that, if there was a remains, like if it was a whole casket or if they were just removed, so in a lot of instances they couldn't find anything when they dug down, so they just took a box and would shovel up some dirt in the area, but that box would be marked, and then when you went to the grave they'd say, okay, it belongs to 001 dash whatever. I mean, they were extreme. They would go to churches and say, look, we've got 25 graves in a church that's going to be inundated and not going to be relocated, or it's a cemetery plot, and we don't know. We need someplace to put it. They would pay the church money to take them and either enlarge the cemetery they had, or to put it in the cemetery. They found a place for all of it. If you wanted to have your remains, say your grandfather's remains, moved to Seattle, Washington, they'd pay to have it moved, and they would hold ceremonies, and just the same way you would do if you were burying somebody for the very first time.
How about that?
But they had Rivers and Harbors Acts gave them very detailed information about what you had to do by law. There was a grave in Hartwell where they had to go to federal court and say it's the elevation. It would be located on an island, and a lot of the people that were still alive, it was their relatives. They all went to court and said, "Hey, we don't want the cemetery moved. It's going to be an island." So a judge had to basically tell the government, "I'm relieving you of liability of things that may happen in the future."
Well, they couldn't get to the grave.
Well, they could get to them before the lake formed, because you just dig them up. But the relatives all said, "Look, it's going to be an island. You can't do anything with it. You're not going to be using it anyway, and it's a small island. Basically, all that's there is a cemetery." So this judge ruled on the case. He said, "Look, basically, the Corps of Engineers were releasing you your liability of moving it. If something happens in the future, it's not on you anymore."
Well,
so other than that, if they knew it existed, they had to move it. If they didn't, they were in violation of the law, and they could, there could be problems. So they had a whole section of the real estate property office and project office in Gainesville, and that was one of their sections when they had a person that was in charge of doing all that.
Well, that's good. That should hopefully put people's minds at ease.
Did they cover some graves? May have. I don't know.
But not intentionally.
No. They didn't intentionally say, well, this cemetery down this valley, no, we're not going to move it because we just don't have time. No, they knew exactly by doing the surveys exactly where these things were. So.
Now, let me ask you this. You know very well there's tons of stories, legends, myths that have cropped up about Lake Lanier. Why do you think that is? What is it that causes all these things to be?
Well, I don't think that there's any more going on here that would be going on in other places, other lakes, man-made lakes or so. Lanier's bigger. Lanier has more traffic. I mean, you have millions of people visit here a year. It's close to a big city. It gets the notoriety Lake Lanier does of other lakes that the Corps has, or other lakes in the United States that don't get the the press coverage. I mean, people that work for the Corps of Engineers, if you go somewhere other place and you tell them where you're from, they know exactly where Lake Lanier is. They might not know where other projects are, but they know where Lanier is. You get more if you have more people, then you're going to have more stories.
There you go.
That's the only explanation I can give it. I can't. That's the only explanation I can give you on that.
Well, it's just a numbers thing.
Yeah, you're if your lake is bigger and you got more people to visit then every situation that's associated with lakes, you're going to have more of it.
And people love that stuff.
Oh, they must. Every time I turn around, every year and during Halloween, I get a call from one of these stations. We want to do a story about the lake and is it haunted and everything. I'm thinking, I've never personally experienced any of that, so I can't speak to it intelligently. So I have to just say I don't know.
But it gets clicks and people interested in
it. Might be. I mean, I've heard the stories of catfish big as Volkswagens and.
You think they would have caught one or found one, or they'd be
I don't know.
Evidence?
I've never seen. I've seen some large fish come out of the lake, but no. It has its. As I said, other places have their own stories too. They just don't have as many because it's just not as well known in places.
Gotcha. Now, when it's a severe drought like we had a few years ago, you would think if there was some monstrous size fish, catfish or whatever, you would think maybe there would be some signs of something like that when the water is way, way, way down.
I don't know that, it's like, what do you call it over in Loch Ness Monster?
Yeah.
I don't know. I've never seen it, so I don't know. I can't speak intelligently about it. that's the only answer I've got for that.
Of all the things that you know about the dam, the lake, everything, you are the walking, living, breathing authority on it. Is there still one or two things that more than anything else really piques your interest still?
I knew you were going to ask that question. No, not really. I can't think of any one thing that is, other than the fact that looking back, I would have hated to have been in charge of something like that.
Oh,
The sheer, like any construction, of any like building Hoover Dam, something like that. I mean, there was a lot more involved in building Hoover Dam than Lake Lanier, and I would have hated it. And you would just having to be in charge of so many things happening in real time, and happening as, this will affect that will affect this.
is there one thing that you think people should know about the dam or the lake that most people have no clue about, but they should be aware of?
I can't think of a single question that I think people should know. Well, it's a man-made lake, one. Now, I haven't had people before ask me, are just shocked when they find out it was built in the 50s if they'd never come here. But it's a man-made lake.
There's no natural lake south of middle of Midwest somewhere?
Large lakes.
Yeah, there were natural,
Yeah, you see, there were a lot of lakes, ponds on the lake. When they were building Lanier, several places, several communities, I think there was one of in Hall County, wanted the Corps to approve a weir dam, which is an impoundment dam, so that if the lake dropped down below 1070, they could regulate the water and keep the elevation of the lake higher. And they said, no, you'd have to pay for it, and two, you could cause problems with the navigation with a dam.
Right.
But there were a lot of ponds. There were Lake Warner up near Dunlop, and it was called Dunlop Dam up near in Hall County.
Oh.
It was a huge recreational area at the turn of the century, and it had long since been abandoned.
Huh.
When the lake started to fill up, wells that had been dry for 50 years all of a sudden sprang to life because the water table moved up. Remember those rangers telling me that you could go into a park in the middle of July, it would be 91 degrees, 98% humidity, and you'd see the brown leaves of autumn and go where the trees were drowning.
How about that?
And all kinds of creatures, snakes, road people, indigenous animals flee. Well, they were getting their habitat was being flooded. They were getting out of Dodge.
Right. Somebody should make some legend about the snakes coming out of the lake when they flooded it.
Well, it wasn't a legend. They came out.
But they could really get some facts in that.
You just don't think of things like that because you're not privy to them. You weren't around them, and it's not something you see every day. You don't see an area that is flooded over. And basically, what was happening is the trees drowned. When you saw flooding, when you saw the impoundment process started, you were basically seeing some of the things they were building it for, which is the flooding, especially close to the Chattahoochee River channel or the Chestatee, because those areas flooded. It wasn't if, it was when it was going to flood. Things like that. Those were things that you just didn't see every day, and when they were happening, seeing a landmark like a bridge or a place that you grew up in, that you maybe had been around all your life, and all of a sudden you're seeing the water just slowly taking it over. It would be like seeing things in this area that you're familiar with, and all of a sudden they said, we're going to build a 500-acre lake in the middle of Buford and Sugar Hill. Yeah. You're going to see things disappear, and you're never going to see them again. Even when the lake goes down, it can't go below 1040. That's, I think, 1040 or 1045. That's permanent power. You can't produce power after that, so they never let it get any lower than that.
Okay.
So you have to. Producing power on a lake or a reservoir, if you have hydropower like they do at Buford, it's not the size of the lake, it's the elevation, it's how deep it is, because you need the force of water to push those generators. So when the lake got down to in 2008 when it got down really low, you saw things that hadn't been out of the water since the late 50s when the lake was forming.
Yeah, I read about
for the
some
first
of that.
time.
A lot of it's in your book too.
Over near Thompson Creek Park, old Highway 53 popped out of the water. Hadn't been out of the water, and you could see it. It was clear as a bell. I mean, you saw
the whole racetrack.
Now that didn't pop out of water, but the bleachers did. Where you could see remnants of the bleachers, that did pop out of water. And because my wife and I went over there to see it. It's over near Laurel Park. Yeah, we went over to the boat ramp there, and you look to the left, people just walking around. You saw the cinder block pattern of the steps like they would build for the bleachers. The actual wood bleachers were gone. But the track itself was in extremely deep water, and there's no way as I said, you can't get down any lower than 1040 because you have to put 1045. It's one of the level because it's called permanent power pool. You can't let it get any lower than that, or you can't produce electricity. So
we got to have that.
And you're not you'll never see it get that low. Now, Lanier has most dams have spillways that are on the dam itself, like Hartwell has. They have called Tainer gates, which are curved gates, and they're designed to allow the gate to move up and down in water easier, where there's not as much pressure on them. But they release water down spillways, and you've seen pictures of hundreds of times of things like Lanier's spillway has no gates on it. It has no concrete. It's just a flat, level area that's about 100 yards long. And maybe in places 50, 60 yards wide and narrow in places. If you're traveling on Buford Dam Road and you're going towards the dam in Gwinnett County, when you cross Lanier Park, when you pass Lanier Park, as the road starts going up, if you look to the right, you can see it mostly in the fall when the leaves are gone. You'll see a flat, level chute. That's the spillway. It's an ungated spillway. It was designed to never be used. In other words, they took all the records they had for flooding and height of the Chattahoochee River at that time, and they added a safety comfort margin to that. And to date, the highest the lake's ever got is 1077. You got to get 1085, and then once it gets to 1085, water starts flowing out of that chute, and it'll continue flowing out till the water drops below 1085. Wow. It's a natural, ungated spillway.
Well, that's good.
And it's several miles from the dam because Buford is an earth dam. You can't build a spillway on an earth dam.
Right. Well, that makes sense.
But likely they'll be used because they can release, if the lake gets in, the top of the dam's 1,090 feet. So if you get anywhere near where there's going to be a problem, they would have been running those generators and opening the sluice. They have a sluice long before that, and they can reduce water out of that lake pretty quick with that sluice. But no one particular thing jumps out at me as being something that people, sometimes I wonder about people when they do things, whether they're not necessarily thinking about the lake, but nothing that they should know that I would think they would know.
Well, I feel comfortable if there's nothing that you think we need to know, that there's nothing we need to know.
Yeah, there's probably things in the book I have forgotten about, and but it was a big thing. It was a big project, and like I said, I wouldn't even. If someone said, "Okay, today you're going to be in charge of doing all this," I probably wouldn't be able to get up in the morning. It's just too much stuff involved. I mean, so the details to do this kind of work, it just what's entailed on building something like this. And I said the resident engineer for Lanier, he just got finished building Allatoona. And then he moved to Lanier, and then when he finished Lanier, he went to Hartwell. And then when he finished Hartwell, he went to the Pearl River on Mississippi, where he built the Saturn V test facilities for NASA.
Oh, wow.
And then he moved back to Anderson, South Carolina, is where he retired. He came back to this area. So they moved around, and a lot of the people that came to the area to work, when the project was finished, they stayed. A lady right up off of Swanee Dam Road used to live there with her husband, and he had since passed when I talked to her, but I've got a picture of him in the book where he was working on the dam, and he had moved around a lot of different places, and when they finished Lanier, he decided to just stay here. And
why not? It's a great place to stay.
And a lot of them did. A lot of them would travel with these companies because the dam building in the United States was at its heyday between the 30s and the late 50s. They built more after the late 50s, but not to
Not
the
nearly.
number, because they were developing the ACF River system, the Savannah River, and all these. I mean, these engineers had grandiose plans. They wanted to make Atlanta a port city. They were going to try to connect the Chattahoochee, Chestatee, and the Toccoa River together eventually with locks and dams. They had all these grandiose plans, but you can plan all like the re-regulation dam that's still on the books as far as I know. It's never been deauthorized, and it's basically where Settles Bridge is. Where down a little bit further below that, they were going to build a dam, a re-regulation dam, to pump water back into Buford at night, like they do Carter's, and so that when electricity is the cheapest, you're pumping water back in the reservoir to run it out when electricity is the most expensive. So you're benefiting yourself. You're just filling up the bathtub, so to speak, to release more water. But it's still on the book. It was as of the 90s, and it's never came up with the money. And probably, when they built Lake Lanier, they didn't have to do an environmental impact study.
Oh,
I mean, that would take you probably 10 years just to do that. And so,
very true.
but that was a heyday. So they had all these grandiose plans. They really did. I've seen some of them about wanting to make Atlanta a port city, but so many things were obstacles to it. The fact that you had so many private dams on one river that they would have had to purchase, so the benefit to cost would have been it wouldn't have been what they could have done legally.
Yeah.
Looking at those, and it's not in the book a lot, but looking at those hearings, congressional hearings, some of them were just a hoot. I mean, some of the stuff they said and did and asked, and
some things never change.
It's just the way it is. Naming the lake and things like that. I mean,
I still wish they named it after Bobby Dodd. But as you said, that don't play on the radio.
Yeah, and that's
very
correct.
Well.
I remember reading that, and it was a book on Hartsfield, and I saw that, and I thought, this is perfect. I cannot not say that. So, and I use that every time I speak. I say that. Even when I do on Harwell, I said, look, I haven't found my aha moment for Harwell, so you're going to get one for Lanier. So here it is. Yeah. And I don't know how true that was. But
I've read it. I hadn't heard that before. Yeah. I've read it several places. So it's got to be some truth to it.
And I've heard other places in the United States. I heard somebody was telling me one time about a dam up in New York. It was called the Gad Dam. And so guy said, so you know what would come out of that. So.
Well, Dave, listen, man, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. This has been awesome. We thank you, the city, the community of Sugar Hill thanks you, this area thanks you for doing this. Is there anything else you want to leave with us, words of wisdom to live by?
Can't think of anything wrong. I think of 100 things after I leave out of here, but right now I can't think of anything.
Well, we really do appreciate it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it.